Nadaljujemo naš simpozij, tokrat z gostom, ki prihaja iz Nemčije, Martin Reiche, ki je trenutno tudi rezidenčni umetnik v Mariboru. Martin je računalničar, raziskovalec in medijski umetnik. Na simpoziju pa bo govoril še o eni mogoče manj vidni stvari, kot so zvočniki na ulicah, na mestnih ulicah, ampak isto nevidni, kot je sam zvok po svoji naravi in materiji. Se pravi, govoril bo o valovanjih in frekvencah, ki nas vse bolj obkrožajo v našem življenju in naseljujejo tudi javne prostore. Govoril bo o svojem projektu KiloHertz, ki na nek način odstira militantno uporabo medijev, militantno uporabo zvoka tudi v funkciji družbene kontrole. Kaj več vam bo pa povedal?
Thank you. I'm not really sure what you said, but I guess it was all good. It was really nice. Thank you. Yeah, that's perfect. We get this out of there. Okay, perfect. So yeah, welcome. I'm Martin Reiche from Berlin. I'm a media artist and I'm a computer scientist by degree. I'm currently doing an artist in residence program in Maribor, which has made it quite easy to get here and talk to you about my latest project and also about a little more works that I did in the past that led to the project that I was executing the last, which is called KiloHertz and was just almost probably introduced by you, Luka. And I'm just going to start a little bit with maybe talking about myself. I just did that. So yeah, hello Sonica. Hi, I'm glad to meet you. And I'm first going to start off with a couple of works that I did in the past, just to give you an overview of the aesthetics that I'm usually working with and the way how I work. So talking about first the work from 2014, actually shown first time in 2015. It's called Drone Garden. It's an installation. I would call it a sculptural installation to get away from the idea of, well, installation for a lot of people, if it has to do with something with digital technology, is something that you can touch and that you can interact with. So they read installation and they understand interactive installation and they touch it, they break it, and they don't know what they did. So this work has to be understood or should be understood as a sculpture. And it's a work that deals with, it's a biographical work that deals with a lot of issues that I ran into as a computer scientist. So as a computer scientist, you're dealing a lot with code. You're trained as an engineer, and being trained as an engineer, well, what university does to you if you're studying this is, it's not really telling you how to program or how to behave as a computer scientist in a work environment, but it changes your brain, so you think you start to learn to think in very analytical ways and in very structured ways, and I mean that actually in a bad sense. So for me, I did this was part of a solo show, this work, and I wanted to, fill this gap between computer science and media art, because I'm, for myself, started to study media art as a way out of the computer science, the way how computer science changes your mind. So for me, it was important to do something else. But in this work, it was I was trying to find the aesthetics that I saw day to day working in a corporation as a computer scientist. These aesthetics I wanted to transform somehow and bring into a media art piece. So I made this installation, which basically consists of a computer network which uses all the same hardware as industrial data centers. So as you can see it as a very, very, very small version of the internet in which the same rules apply as the internet. And this little internet has 4 participants, and 3 of them are in these little glasses. can see them here a little bigger. This is simply microcontrollers with an Ethernet interface, with a network interface. They are programmed to behave in a specific way. They are programmed to behave in a way that they are constantly trying to attack each other. So they are basically in a state of electronic warfare against each other. And the idea of this, or behind this work, is to question how easy or how prevalent is electronic warfare, in a sense like hacking attacks from institutions against institutions, governments against governments, governments against corporations, corporations against governments. So this is it's a big field, and it's something that is inherent to the internet, is the fact that you can abuse it, that you can attack other participants of the network. So in this work, these three computers are constantly attacking each other, and by this attack, they are eating up all the bandwidth in the network. So every computer network is bandwidth limited, which means there's only a certain amount of data that you can put through a cable, and at some point you cannot put more data through without the losses in the transmission being too big. So there's a natural limit. You see that every time you're using Wi-Fi, it's, well, if you're lucky, it's fast enough. If you're in a public Wi-Fi in a cafe, it's probably not very fast. It's because of the limitations of the Wi-Fi, and that also applies for any networks based on cables. So you can see something like this bandwidth limitation as a limited resource, as in nature has limited resources like sunlight. So if you have three little plants, and making this analogy now to these three little microcontrollers in the beaker glasses, which are filled with liquid, it's actually not water. It's quite important to say. It would not function with water. So if you have three little plants and you plant them close to each other, they will at some point compete for sunlight. So they will grow, and they will grow leaves, and they will compete for sunlight, and most probably one or two of them will die while one prevails and is kind of the winner of this battle. So that's an analogy that you can use also for the internet, especially if you think about attacks, warfare. I would say, sorry, no word for that. But the way how the participants of a network interact is that they're always competing for something. So there's a form of competition for this bandwidth in this regard. And so I wanted to get down to these aesthetics of the codified, the aesthetics of computer science that I saw every day in my work as a computer scientist. And I had a lot of computer scientists also at the opening of this exhibition, which was very nice to see that they came. We're really, really happy that somebody finally put this into an art exhibition and made an art exhibition basically out of the problems that these people face all the day, and the aesthetics that these people face every day. Because as a computer scientist, you actually have a lot of power. If you're working for companies like Google, Amazon, Facebook, you can be lucky enough to work on the predictive algorithms that give you the results of the things that you should see. And well, based on the way how this developer sees the world, the way how the results are shown to you are dependent on that in a little sense, because these people built the models on which the prediction takes place. So if that is the way how they see the world, this codified aesthetics, or this aesthetics of seeing the world, is somehow translated into, in the end, into the final product that we use every day. Then we should be aware of how the world of such developers, in a sense, at least the mental world of these developers look like, in order to understand what we're actually dealing with. So that was one work. There's another work from last year that I also just briefly going to talk about. It's again a sculptural installation, as I would call it. It's comprised of these two little screens with DVD players on them, and there's this sculptural structural part which is made of I think 450 BNC-T connectors. So this is the small little connectors that you use not really at home. Some people might use it at home if you're having a TV. You want to connect it to an antenna cable, so you're kind of connecting two plugs into each other. But the moment you want to have maybe a third one in there, you need like a connector which is shaped like a little T and has two outputs and one input, so you can actually connect the network to each other. The interesting thing about this connector is it's very small, maybe that size, and has a very, very nice shape because it's this T shape, so it has this 90-degree angles. And while working on the project KiloHertz that I'm going to explain after this, I was dealing with these little connectors, but I was dealing with maybe 10 of them, and I realized, well, you can actually make nice sculptures out of it. So I went on a residency in Brazil where this work was executed, and I ordered 1,000 of them. So they're actually quite expensive, but I figured out that with around 400, you can already make reasonable sized sculptures with it. So in the end, this sculptural part started to exist. And what's important for the works that I'm doing is that they are all still functional. So they are all still functioning somehow in the way how they were supposed to function, which means all these connectors, they're still connected to each other, and they can still transmit data, they can still transmit energy. So if you put a composite video signal, analog composite video signal into it, you can put another cable somewhere on the sculpture, and you will get the same signal out with a little bit of distortion that comes through the sculpture. So if you put more than one signal into it, so you are putting two signals into it, then you get a nice effect of a very distorted colors and distorted images. So it's not the same as mixing two video signals with each other, but it's mixed on a much lower level, on a frequency-based level, on the way how composite video signal is working, which means it creates a lot of distortions, it creates a lot of noise inside of this video signal. So you will have a very noisy image, and you will also have a very colorful image, because usually the way how this image data gets codified is there's basically two signals on the cable at the same time. One codifies the shape of the image that you see, and the other one codifies the color information. So the moment you deal with, you kind of tamper with the color information, you get these bright colors everywhere, and the things are starting to look kind of distorted and also colorful, extremely colorful. Then this will be not the last, but this is also actually the second last piece that I produced this year. It's just has been shown at Ars Electronica. It's called Shell Performance. It uses again this idea of this codified aesthetics. So you see probably similarity to the first work that I showed. It's a little triptych installation, kind of it's actually a program that is running on 3 computers, which are all connected to these. Each screen is connected to one computer, and it's a little program that runs there that constantly analyzes all the data on the computer and spits out parts of the information that it finds. So it spits out images that it finds. It spits out a lot of basically garbage from PDF documents, from text files. It analyzes MP3 files. So it gives you somehow like a collage, a digital collage of the content of your hard drive. And for this specific piece, I didn't use my own hard drive or some person's hard drive, but it was executed in collaboration with with a media art collective from they're currently in Linz, called Kairos. They did in 2014. They did a trip to Ghana, to a place called Abobloshi, which is officially inside of the perimeter of Accra. And Abobloshi is an electronic waste dump, so that is where your old hard drives or your old cell phones, they will end up there at some point. It's actually illegal to dump stuff there, but people do it. People do it a lot. Big companies ship all their electronic waste from Europe, a lot of stuff from the United States, to this dump, Abobloshi in Accra. And the people there live under extreme, well, not live, they work under extreme conditions on these electronic waste dumps, and basically try to find out the parts of gold and parts of precious metals that are inside of, well, a cell phone or inside of your computers etched on the plates. So they are trying to get this gold, for example, and then sell it on another market. But they also like to sell used hard drives. And they like to sell used hard drives because on most hard drives there's still a lot of very personal, sensitive information. And they can sell this very easily to people that want to commit fraud. So especially if you have hard drives with information like everything that determines your identity somehow, or credit card information that's somewhere still hidden in your browser history, that's perfect, because then if an adversary gets this kind of information, he can use it not specifically against you, but buy something on your credit card and so on and so on. So this is actually a big market. And I was dealing with 3 of these hard drives, which actually included also a lot of pornography and a lot of highly sensitive information, and made this digital collage based on these the data found on these hard drives. And yeah, and there's this last work that I'm going to show you before the other part of that talk is this piece called Firewall, and it already uses barbed wire, which is now prevalent in the works that I'm doing. You're going to see that also in KiloHertz. And this is just it's basically a big sculpture. This is, I think, 5 times 3 meters. It can be whatever size, which is basically consisting of a geometrical pattern based on these circuit breakers. So there's alternate current circuit breakers that you might have in your home somewhere, so that you're not getting completely killed when you're accidentally getting your fork into the power connection or something like that, or your child doing that. And a lot of barbed wire, which is also highly conductive, so it can be used as a way to transfer data if you want so. So this was a work that deals with the idea of, okay, barbed wire is also a material that's used for protecting yourself against adversaries from the outside. And I was living in Brazil at that time, in São Paulo, which is a place where barbed wire is extremely prevalent. So I've never seen so much barbed wire on one place. Everybody builds, you have a house, you build a fence of barbed wire around it, just to be sure that no one can enter it that you don't want this person to enter. So also buying barbed wire there is the simplest thing that you can imagine. You just go to the next store, they probably even have barbed wire there, so you can just buy it. And then in some sense, the circuit breakers are, they're also there for protection against electronic current running through your body and potentially killing you. So yeah, it's about kind of defensive mechanisms, a bit of defensive architectures. And yeah, I'm now starting probably with the second part of the talk, which is now finally about the word KiloHertz. And I call this talk Surveilling Military Radio Frequency Communication. So RF, well, to make it a little shorter, is radio frequency. This work has been executed together with a couple of partners. This is why I'm showing them there, and I'm just gonna start with a little bit of motivation. So KiloHertz is I would say a critical technology project, and the motivation goes like this. In 2010, I had a roommate that came to me and he wanted to show me some some nice stuff that he likes. There was a number station. So it was, maybe you've heard of what a number station is. It's basically a radio station that transmits all over the world. There's a lot of these radio stations. They transmit all over the world to specific times of the week, usually a couple of minutes each week. And everything that they transmit is electronic voice, or sometimes a human voice, reading out numbers. That goes a little bit like this. Let me just see if I can show you one. Nope, that one. We have sound.
0, 9, 5, 0, 9, 5, 0, 9, 2, 5, 6, 1, 4, 5, 0, 9, 5, 0, 9, 5.
Okay, I'm going to stop that there. No, there you go. So this is this was an example of a number station called E06B, I think. It's in English, but it's actually a Russian station. And these number stations are used by, or have been more extensively used by intelligence agencies all over the world. So there's somehow a little bit still a relic of the Cold War. And there's especially a lot of these that are originating from the former Soviet Union, from Russia now. And there's also a lot coming from the United States. And there's also a couple of them coming from Germany. So they are transmitting some rather cryptic information from parts of the world. And you can actually, if you have a world receiver, you could potentially, if you know the right time of the day and the right time of the week, you could tune into that still now. And it's relatively clear that they are meant to have a one-sided, one-way communication to, well, potentially agents in other countries to tell them the current situation, what they should, but what in general just happens, and how they should prepare for some operation that is going on. But there's more. There's also one very, very famous, not number station, but a very, very famous station. It's called the Buzzer, or UVB76, which is, let me see. No. Okay. So this just goes on and on like this, and this has been going on and on like this, I think, since the 70s, without any interruptions, any major interruptions. Most of the time, still during the Cold War, this was already known, these kind of this communication, because it's a very specific frequency, and you can hear it almost all over the world. And you could still hear it right now if you wanted to, probably, especially also here. And this was, people thought that it might be some kind of, I don't know, trigger, like the moment it disappears, something might happen, because it has been there for a long time, and it has been there, well, since the Cold War was on in that regard. So then people were started to get a little bit nervous when that still was still in existence after the wall came down, and well, after the Soviet Union was disappearing. Now this is still on, and they changed the place from where they operate a couple of times, and I think they're now based somewhere in near St. Petersburg, so it's definitely a Russian station, but still it's not really clear what this is about. I think 2 or 3 times already there has been some other transmission on there, just again a person saying numbers, and nobody really knows what's going on with that station. So there's a lot of mystery kind of about this, about these stations, and that gave me some motivation to work with the idea of, well, with radio frequencies, and with also kind of political questions around radio frequency. Because in a sense, radio waves are somewhat another form of territory that is lying upon the physical territory of the world. And it's invisible, you can translate it into sound, If you want, you can translate it also into other forms of like visualization, for example. So there's a lot of satellites, of course, flying around us, and every form of communication, wireless communication, is based on radio frequency. So of course also your cell phone, all of that, they all work on specific parts of the radio frequency spectrum to transmit their information. So it's something that is surrounding us all the time, and it's invisible, of course, but you can create electronic appliances, technical appliances to receive and to transmit radio waves. So I was interested in that kind of dichotomy between radio frequency as a layer and the actual territory of the actual physical territory of the countries. So if you're, for example, looking just at, this is a pretty famous image, it's the United States frequency allocations table, which means it's just a visualization of how in the United States the radio frequency spectrum is divided for usage by public as well as private institutions. It's a pretty big and complicated table, and it's mostly a lot of things are not allocated, and there's a couple of things there. It says, well, there's radio amateur band, so that's for people that actually want to have officially a license to transmit radio waves, to just talk to each other, or just for fun as a hobby. And then there's a lot of very important applications, especially, of course, there's military applications. There's military satellites surrounding us that you want to communicate to. There's civil satellites you want to communicate to. There's civic institutions that communicate towards each other based on specific parts of the frequency band. There is Wi-Fi, there is 3G networks, there is FM radio, the very classic, you turn on the radio in your car. That's also part of, well, the spectrum. I think it's even the green one in the middle on the second line. No, it's not. Somewhere. Oh, it's on the fourth line, it doesn't really matter. So there's a lot of applications. Radar, for example, also falls into that direction. And the problem with radio frequencies is that radio communications, that doesn't really care or respect country borders. So you have to have a process to make sure that you're not really disturbing each other. And officially, there's a big international contract that says that every country has its sovereignty over its radio frequency waves. So the whole frequency spectrum, all the electromagnetic waves are under the regulation of the government, basically. So the government can for itself say, okay, we want to have this specific part of the spectrum for our own purposes, or they can say, well, we're going to sell other parts of the spectrum for public companies, private companies. And these private companies can buy them usually for a lot of money. So for example, you've probably heard of in the last years, there's been more and more news about what's it called? LTE, or even next generation transmission technologies, and they're usually the companies are the governments are now selling parts of the radio frequency spectrum for usage in the specific technologies, and they sell that to companies for horrendous amounts. Like this goes into billions of US dollars or euros for one single frequency block. So this is an extreme investment for these companies, and it's a big amount of money for the government. So they can make a lot of money by selling these parts of the spectrum. And then there's of course a couple of military agreements about that. For example, this important one, which is called the NJFA, is the NATO Joint Civil and Military Frequency Agreement, and well, it says a lot about that. The radio frequency spectrum is really important. That's kind of the bottom line of the first paragraph. And the second one says, well, and it's also extremely important for military applications. And if we think about, well, we have this nice NATO thing, then we should kind of harmonize that. Like the European Union right now wants to harmonize everything. This is also the radio frequency band has to be harmonized in some way also. And in another way, as another political layer, the radio frequencies can be, especially as they don't respect country borders, can be a problem for some countries, especially for some countries which you would not necessarily now understand as democratic countries in that regard. For example, there's a couple of radio stations that you can hear or listen to in China, in the People's Republic of China, that are coming from other countries. And well, the People's Republic of China is quite interested in the public in China not being able to listen to these radio stations. For example, the Radio Free Asia. And what they are doing is they're actively jamming the radio station. So you could potentially start your radio. You could hear the transmission of the radio station in I don't know where, Taiwan, for example. But the government has built big towers that are actively jamming, which means they're actively kind of destroying or distorting the signal that you were supposed to hear from the radio station. So they are at this time, even in this for this Radio Free Asia, they are overlaying it with a folk song, Chinese folk song, which goes like this. So this was supposed to be a news radio or a news station, more leftist news station called Radio Free Asia. But this is what you hear in China if you tune into that station. So you hear this Chinese folk song because the government basically doesn't want you to listen to that radio station. So that's again a very political problem with that. So based on these motivations, I started a project called KiloHertz. And it started in 2015. It's still ongoing, it's still a work in progress, and it has been executed 2 times now. One time in Estonia, just about 50 kilometers from the border to Russia, in southern Estonia, and now also this year in the state of Sao Paulo, in Brazil, pretty much in the middle of nowhere, and very close to a military base there. In a city with, 1,000 inhabitants, which is about 300 kilometers away from Sao Paulo, and on the other side, 300 kilometers away from Rio de Janeiro, so it's kind of in the middle of nowhere. There's, 3 streets going there. So this was kind of an image of the first prototype built in Estonia. So these antennas, I have to say, they are all kind of do-it-yourself style. So this is not call this a sophisticated sculpture, but this is meant to be executed in the field somewhere where you don't have access to that much stuff. So in this regard, the only thing that you need is a couple of wood poles, a lot of copper wire, and a little computer, which could be, for example, a Raspberry Pi. I'm currently using these small computers, and if you're lucky, an internet connection, so the system can take the recorded data and the analyzed data and send that back to a central server to build a big database. So the idea behind KiloHertz is not necessarily so much to just build these sculptures, but these build sculptures, these little radio stations, receiving stations, are there in order to create something like a big catalog of the radio frequency spectrum. And well, I think this is the one how it looks like in Brazil. So see, this is in summer. Well, actually, it's winter in Brazil. This is how winter in Brazil looks. It was 35 to 40 degrees usually during the day, so it's quite a nice winter. And it's something that you wouldn't even understand as an antenna if you're not knowing how an antenna could look like. And let me just see what the next no, that's the one. And the idea, because these antennas, they're in the KiloHertz project. The title of the installation was Surveilling Military Radio Frequency Communication. So what these antennas are doing, they're not listening to just something, but they are actively tuned into frequency ranges which are allocated for governmental and military usage. So they are, for example, in this part there in Brazil, they were tuned into Brazilian military communication channels. In other parts, for example, in Estonia, they were tuned into NATO military communication bands. And depending on the country, there's actually the question, of course, is this a legal action to do? In most countries, the answer would be no, but in a lot of countries, the answer is, well, it depends on what you're doing with these things. So that's probably the first thing to know. I'm skipping over that. Yeah, that's the territory. That's a bit how it looks like in Brazil, where this sculpture is standing. And yeah, this is a part of a map. So maybe you see the black lines. This is the streets this is just 2 streets basically that you see on this map. And I think the width of the map, that's about 150 kilometers. So there's really not much going on. There's not many people living there, but they have a couple of military bases there. So that was the perfect location also to execute this project. So talking about the radio frequency territory in Brazil, the question is how does the territory look like in order to execute such a project? This is a map of the 3G, 4G, and 2G, 3G, and 4G cell phone network coverage in this area. So you see there's just a couple of dots. That's not just because they're cities, but because especially the part down there, that's a national park and there's a lot of mountains everywhere. So it's really complicated and really cost intensive to establish a big network, big cell phone coverage network. And this is why you see that there's not a lot of coverage, but that makes it also quite complicated to receive, for example, military signals. And I'm going to explain a little later why. First, maybe talking about the question of how do I get to know, how do I know this information? What is a military radio allocation? Why do I know where the military is communicating? Well, for a government, of course, it makes sense to tell people which parts of the radio frequency spectrum are allocated, reserved for military, because usually you have laws that says you're not allowed to listen to that stuff. At the same time, because you think it's sensitive, you don't really want to publish it too much, because then people would get interested in that. So it's quite complicated how to deal with that. So most countries have a publication that there's every day they publish the stuff that happened in the parliament. So all the new laws, they're getting published somehow, and in the same documents they publish also these radio frequency allocations. So you can basically read them there, but they are meant only to be read by professionals and not by the local government. So in a sense, if you want to make a big archive of these frequencies, not only the frequency ranges that are used by the military, but also maybe what exactly is going on these frequencies, then you have to dig through these documents, and through a lot of them in, of course, always the native language, which makes it quite complicated if you're not if you don't speak Portuguese, for example, like me. So this is another one for NATO. Doesn't really matter. So this is a little close-up of that antenna again. And questioning a little bit of antenna theory, because it's quite important for that project, is so you have two types of radio waves usually, and the question is, why am I actually able to capture these military radio waves? And I'm not only looking for military radio waves from the countries that are actually inside, in which territory I already am, but also of radio waves of foreign countries, which just happen to go over the border. For example, there's a thing called over-the-horizon radar, which makes it possible to have a radar which just goes 2,000 kilometers, and you usually build it at the end of your country and just point it towards the enemy or towards another sovereign state, and you can basically see movement of troops or movement of bigger groups of people in foreign territory. So the question is, why is that even possible? And has to be a little theory about it. There's if you see that, does it work? So you have these two little trucks. They want to communicate to each other, and of course there is a direct line of sight. So there is a direct wave how they can communicate, but just using this direct path. But there's also going to be this reflected ground wave, which means there's a wave which goes and gets reflected from the Earth, and then the reflected wave is again received by the other truck. And if you think about that on a broader scale, also not only the surface of the Earth can work as a reflector, but also the ionosphere, or some parts of the ionosphere, which is this layer around the Earth, which is kind of has specific properties to reflect radio frequency waves. And in a way, if you have the right frequency range, then you can make this kind of this game that you're sending out a wave. It gets reflected from the ionosphere, it gets reflected again from the Earth, it gets reflected by the ionosphere, and through that you can make the path almost over the whole world. So you can get a radio transmission for not only your line of sight, but for thousands of kilometers. That makes it extremely interesting, of course, for military usage, and that makes it also interesting because you might be able here to receive these radio waves from the United States even, or you might here be able to receive this Russian radio stations. This is why I also mean that this buzzer, this radio station is actually, you can hear it here because it uses exactly these frequencies which just bump between the surface of the Earth and the ionosphere. So when I was interested in wherever I'm building these installations, I was interested in what can you actually hear there. What is the type of information, what is the amount of radio transmissions, and where do they come from that you can hear there. So the way how these antennas are built, building an antenna is actually an extremely simple thing. So this is why I mean it's a DIY project, because you can literally just have a little bit of knowledge, or just a very good recipe on how to build an antenna, and then you can build your own antenna, which is possible to tune into military radio. You basically just need a long wire which is conductive enough. For example, copper wire is perfectly made for that. I was using very thin copper wire to build my antennas, and they were extremely effective. So all these pictures now, they are all taken from a U.S. military handbook, and they have these pictures in there to say, okay, you're a soldier on the field, and you're having a problem with your antenna. I don't know, you broke your antenna of your receiver. So what can you do? And then they're describing a couple of ways how you can build these antennas. So in a sense also, because I'm surveilling with this installation, surveilling military radio frequencies, but I'm using the same, I'm even using the military, official military documents to see how to make these to make these antennas. So there's a kind of a little bit of a joke in there, of course. This is a little antenna, just a kind of directional antenna, which is really just a wire which has a specific length. You can build an antenna like this, and really just this wire which goes there, which you see, this is really just a little copper wire. So this is something that costs, I don't know, about 10 euros a kilometer. It's really cheap stuff. And the insulators, well, you could use plastic, for example. It's a really, really simple way to build a very effective antenna, not only for receiving, but maybe even for transmitting, even though transmitting is forbidden in most countries, and you can get really into trouble if you're transmitting, especially if you don't know what you're doing. So it's another type of an antenna. I'm just skipping over that. The antennas that I built are so-called inverted V antennas. They look a bit like this. So RT means this is the radio transmitter, and well, basically you just have this, doesn't matter what the thing up there is, but it has two outputs. So it has these two cables coming out, which is just a wire of copper with about 1/4 of the wavelength of the radio frequency that I want to tune into. That's a bit of a detail, doesn't matter. The bottom line is this is extremely simple to build, and this is even extremely simple to build if you're in the middle of nowhere and you don't have any tools. You just need cable and a bit of wire, and you need this transmitter, of course. Even though this transmitter you can build it based on consumer hardware that you can buy for less than $100 right off from Amazon or right off from eBay, and it's perfectly legal to build these things, and there's a lot of these things being sold currently. So yeah, KiloHertz uses multi-band inverted V antennas. They are basically the same as this. They're just using not just one wire in each direction, but a couple of more wires, which have different lengths, and the length, depending on the length, is the frequencies that you can tune into. So they are depending on the length of the antenna wires. Okay, let's go. There's so the stuff that you can then see, because I'm thinking more maybe in that regard more of a visual person than an auditive person. But so I was tuning into a couple of frequencies. This is around 39 megahertz in this area in Brazil, and I was basically just mapping. Okay, what is the amount of energy on each frequency, and it's kind of mapping this over time. So the axis, the vertical axis is time, and the horizontal axis is radio frequency. And you can see that there's a lot of noise in there, of course, but you can also see that, well, there's some on that side. There's some chatter on the radio band, and this is 39 megahertz. I don't really know from that picture what specifically that is, but it's it's a visual form of evidence that something's happening there. That doesn't necessarily mean something if it's not, or for me it doesn't mean something if it's not a frequency band from which I know it is allocated, which means it is reserved for military usage. But this is just a proof of concept, the thing's working and it shows data. So another form of evidence that I could, for example, gather in Brazil was they were in the beginning of 2016, they were allocating, so they were making a law to allocate more parts of the frequency band for military usage. So they were using a specific part of the frequency band around 390 until 400 megahertz. And they were saying, okay, from now on, this is only to be used for military usage. Nobody else is allowed to use it. If you're going to use it and don't have permission from us, we're going to fine you, put you into prison, and all of that stuff. So I was interested in, is this already executed? Like, is this law already not only in effect, but technically executed, for example? So I was building this antenna, I was running the tests, and I was seeing, okay, you see these little dots in the second row. This is markers already for for the channels. They are around, I think, 50 kilohertz wide, and they are used for public security. So they are used for governmental and military communications, and they're already in effect. And well, not in this one, but in some other pictures, I could actually also see that there is communication happening. What I was not doing was recording these communications. There's, well, first of all, it doesn't really make sense because, well, all these communications are encrypted anyways. And at the same time, mostly recording these kind of communications could be understood as illegal, even though you wouldn't be able to hear anything anyway. It's not so clear how to deal with it. So for me, the evidence just that something happens there, and then I can show that without recording the actual audio that I'm hearing, but just by recording the visual analysis, this evidence that something's happening there is for me enough to get my point, or to prove the point that stuff is happening and specific laws are already technically in effect. Okay, at the same time, of course, because it's an architectural kind of an architectural object, it's somehow like an architectural intervention, and it reproduces some interesting aesthetics. If you build this, so I built this fence there. Basically, you see the fence is barbed wire again. But if you build this structure, which is I think 25 square meters, which once belonged to the cattle that was living there. There were a lot of goats living in this place. They didn't like that at all, that I was taking their territory. So I was building my installation there, and then I was realizing, okay, there's a lot of these animals going around, and goats are really, really interested in whatever's happening around them. So I was building a little bit of fence around it. And then realized that the goats didn't really care, so for them the fence was easy to jump over or under, and they were destroying the whole antenna inside of it, so I had to build a stronger fence even. So in the end I built an exclusion zone for all the animals that are rightfully living in this space. And I built this exclusion zone understanding that I'm just reproducing the aesthetics of the exclusion zones that for example, the intelligence agencies build when they build their surveillance stations somewhere in the middle of nowhere. I was building my antenna in the middle of nowhere. I was putting a lot of barbed wire around it. They're doing this. So I was just recreating these things, just in a very amateur way, maybe even to say. So also I'm kind of hiding the fact that this is actually an antenna, because if you don't know what's happening there, you could always say, well, it's just an artwork, blah, blah, blah. Doesn't really matter. Oh, it needs energy. Yeah, it doesn't, whatever. So you couldn't really prove that this is actually doing something that might be, well, in a legal gray area. You couldn't prove it really. So, so it's using the same strategy as these kind of the other side is using against us. So the question of legality, I think I already talked about that a little bit. In most countries, it's legal, and even if it might not be as legal as you might think it is, it's at least in a gray area. And at the same time, well, these antennas could be anything. You could always argue that it's just an technological art project, because reception of a radio frequency wave, it's very hard to show that you actually received something, or to have evidence that you were receiving something. But it's very, very easy to show evidence that you have transmitted something. So this is why transmitting is the really illegal part. Also because you are legally usually not allowed to transmit, because you would have had to pay a lot of money to be allowed to transmit on the radio frequency band. So this is something where the economic factor is way, way more important than the political factor. So you didn't pay to transmit, so you're not allowed to do that. While if you're thinking about just receiving something, it's hard to prove that anyway. So it's really a gray area in that regard.